Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here with me. My name is Christine Ostern. I work for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources in the Division of Forestry, and I coordinate the Forest Legacy Program, which is primarily the Conservation Easement Program for the Division of Forestry. And I'm going to talk with you about conservation easements. And I will be available on the panel discussion on January 19th for questions. I also would direct you to the handout that is provided along with this presentation for more information and also my contact information. You can certainly reach out to me at any point with directly with questions that you might have or that you might not want to bring up at the panel discussion. So an overview of what this presentation will be about is we're going to talk about what is a conservation easement, and there's many different examples to go through, and then we're going to talk about the forestry conservation easement programs in Minnesota DNR, and then I'm going to give some brief examples at the end. So first of all, what is a conservation easement? Conservation easement is a voluntary legally binding agreement between a landowner, also a grantor, and a holder, which is a grantee. And the easement limits different rights. It has different restrictions, primarily limits development and other uses of the property in order to protect the property. And you'll see on the screen here, this is an example first page of a conservation easement document. You'll notice the extra stamping along the corners. These documents are recorded on the property deed at the local county recorder's office. So who can hold a conservation easement? Different levels of government can be holders of easements from the federal level, state level, down to the local level, such as a county. And then many non-governmental organizations or different conservation organizations can hold conservation easements. An example of that would be the Nature Conservancy. And so how long do conservation easements last? Conservation easements can be for a limited term, and that would be to restrict the land and how it can be used for just a certain period of time, a limited term of time. Or easements can be a perpetual easement, which permanently restricts the use of the property in perpetuity or forever. Easements bind both the current landowner that enters into the easement agreement and all future landowners to the easement terms. This is a description, a picture description, a way of thinking about property rights and how conservation easements affect property rights that's a little bit easier to understand. So when a person owns or purchases a piece of property, they own rights that are associated with that property. And in the picture of the bundle of sticks, which are supposed to represent a bundle of rights, there's different rights that are example rights that are labeled on that. Timber rights, right to build homes or develop the property, mineral rights, access rights, which would be access to the property or across the property to other properties, and the right to sell the property. So landowners own these rights, and a different bundle of sticks come with different pieces of property. For example, not all landowners who own the surface land would own the mineral rights to the land underneath. But anyway, a landowner would own these bundle of rights, and a conservation easement basically breaks apart that bundle of sticks and separates some of them and extinguishes those rights. And in the cases that we'll be talking about, primarily it is the right to develop the property. So what types of restrictions are typically included in a conservation easement? These terms are negotiated jointly between the landowner and the holder at the time of the sale or purchase or of the conservation easement. And typical restrictions include the restriction on building or development on the property, the restriction to subdivide the property, so taking a piece of property and dividing it so that a part of it can be sold or separated from the other part of the property. A restriction on the surface alteration or mining of the property. Industrial, commercial, and agricultural uses can be restricted, or different combinations of those. Public access, and I want to point out that with the forestry easements that the DNR offers, public access is the landowner's choice, whether the landowner wants to restrict that or not. And then forest or vegetation management rights can be restricted by an easement. So with the forest and vegetation management, easement programs vary about this. The forestry easements do have some restrictions, but primarily we are promoting the forest to be managed on the property. We're protecting the forest land and promoting sound management of the forest. And so harvesting and other forest management is permitted, although there are two restrictions on that, or two subjugations, and that is the state approves a forest management plan for the property. So a stewardship plan or a woodland stewardship plan or a forest management plan needs to be in place on the property and kept up to date, and that plan needs to be state approved. And the use of the applicable site level forest management guidelines or best management practices must be used when managing the forest and vegetation on the property. How does the easement impact the landowner? While landowners continue to own the land, they continue to manage the land as long as it's consistent with the restrictions of the easement. Landowners continue to pay property taxes. Landowners must allow the regular inspection of the property by the holder. And so in the case of DNR forestry, we meet with and visit the site where the easement is in place, and we meet with the landowners every year, once a year, or more often if the landowner wishes. And the land remains in private ownership, and the owner can sell the land or pass the land on to their heirs. So what are the benefits of the easement to the landowners? Well, the primary benefit is that the land is protected and is protected forever. So the landowner that has a strong conservation ethic or a strong attachment to the land and wants to see the land managed and protected forever would benefit by an easement with peace of mind that that land will be protected forever and they're leaving a legacy for the future. The land is kept in private ownership. The landowner receives payment for the conservation easement, and there can be some tax benefits to the landowner. So conservation easements, donated versus purchased easements. Many land trusts, for example, the Minnesota Land Trust, tend to rely primarily on donated easements. And so a landowner will donate the easement, and the value of that easement is what is donated to the land trust. Most public agencies, including the DNR, rely on purchased easements. So we primarily, DNR Forestry, purchase easements, conservation easements from landowners. We also accept donated easements, or a landowner can choose to donate a portion of the value of the easement. So how is an easement valued? There are different methods for valuing conservation easements. The primary method is appraisal, and this is the method that's used by DNR Forestry. DNR will contract out a fair market independent appraisal of the property from a contractor that's certified to do those kinds of appraisals for the state. And so the appraiser will value the property before the conservation easement, and then they will do a separate appraisal valuing the property after a conservation easement is placed on the land. And then the difference between the two is what the value of the easement itself is. And so that's how we determine the actual value of the conservation easement. Some of the other methods include formula-based methods where, and they're used by different agencies, different programs, different conservation organizations, but they cannot be used for the DNR forestry easements. So what are the steps involved, or what are some of the factors involved in acquiring forestry conservation easements? First of all, there's some basic eligibility criteria. So because the intent of our program is to protect forest land, we require that the property be primarily forested. We also have a minimum acreage requirement. We like to see that the easement area is at least 20 acres in size, although we can make exceptions for property that have high conservation value or other extenuating circumstances. Then there's a prioritization criteria, set of criteria. And so we look at things like the size of the property. For easement, we tend to prioritize properties that are larger in size as a higher priority. Also the strategic location, and so if the property is next to other protected land, then it is more of a priority. We look at many different environmental benefits that together become the conservation value of the property. So we look at things like habitat, what type of habitat, position in a watershed, how the protected property might contribute to water quality or meeting watershed goals. We look at all different kinds of environmental benefits. We look at public access opportunities, and we tend to prioritize easements that have higher public access opportunities. We look at the economic factors. Again, the intent of our program is to protect forest land for multiple benefits, including economic benefit to local timber economies. And then we look to see if there's partner support. And basically what we are looking for is, does this particular potential project align well with our program? There are many steps involved in acquiring forestry conservation easements, and this is a list of some of those steps. It's a fairly complicated process, but it goes smoothly. It does take some time. I can say from beginning to end, from the time of application to the closing on an easement, the whole process might take 1.5 to 2 years. And a lot of that has to do with available funding. So we do need to apply for or request funding for purchasing easements. And if we happen to be in a cycle where we need to request additional funding, then this could take a little longer. But there's many steps, beginning with a landowner application. And again, we only work with willing landowners. And then there's a project selection process, which I've spoke a little bit about prior to this. Then there's a lot of real estate transactional type work. There's some different documents to go through. We require, for example, looking at property deeds and gathering different information to put together a package that then goes out for appraisal. Then the appraisal process happens, and from that we have the value determined for the easement, and then we have all of the steps involved in closing on the purchase of the easement. I will say that the transactional costs that are involved in acquiring an easement, for example, the cost of the appraisal, the cost of any survey work that needs to be done, title work, recording fees, closing fees, all of those transactional costs are covered by DNR forestry, except if there's any title work that needs to be, any title that needs to be cleaned up on the landowner's side of things. If there's any legal fees involved in that, then the landowner is responsible for that. And we do all of this transactional real estate work with our partners in the Lands and Minerals Division. So I've talked a lot about from a landowner perspective. Now I'm going to speak a little bit about responsibility of the holder of the easement. In this case, it would be DNR Forestry. The holder is held to certain responsibilities, and one of those is to monitor and inspect the property to ensure that the property is being managed with compliance with the restrictions of the easement. And so forestry monitors all of our easements annually. And like I mentioned prior to this, it involves actually going to the property and walking through the property. And it also involves a discussion with the landowner to talk about basic things like what sorts of management activities have happened in the past year. Are there any unusual natural disasters that have affected the property? Are there any plans in the next year for transfer of ownership of the property or any certain management activities that should be known? In some cases, such as prairie bank easements, the holder, in these cases, the DNR has the right to access the property to conduct management activities for habitat enhancement, and that would be things like prescribed burning. And then the holder also has the responsibility to do any enforcement that is needed with making sure that the easement restrictions are, and the easement terms are in compliance. Just a slide here to show the growth of conservation easements in the United States. It's not a new concept. The first easement was used in the 1880s in the Boston area. But it really has taken off in the last couple decades. And so you can see with the timeline here in 1990, there were about 500,000 acres in the US that were in easement. And then the last available data that I could access in 2015, there were over 23 million acres of easement in the United States. And you can see on the map, this comes from the National Conservation Database, all the blue dots are where there are easements in the US. Now I'd like to speak a little bit about the Division of Forestry Conservation Easement Programs. So in Minnesota, DNR acquired its first easement in 1969. It was a trout stream easement. And since then, many other divisions in DNR have easement programs. There's other state agencies and many nonprofits that have been acquiring easements. Other easement holders in Minnesota, like I said, there's other divisions in DNR, Fisheries and Wildlife, and other divisions. Other agencies, state agencies, like the Board of Water and Soil Resources, have very active easement programs. There's federal agency easement programs, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, and the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And then in the last while here, last decade or so, and especially the last few years, many counties have develop their own easement programs. And then, like I've mentioned before, there are many non-governmental organizations that have easement programs, Minnesota Land Trust, the Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, and others. So looking now at the easement programs in DNR, there are 13 different easement programs, and 3 of them are actually 4 of them are what are considered active right now, and 2 of those 4 are Division of Forestry easement programs, the 2 that are highlighted in bold, number 4, number 5, Forest Legacy and Forest for the Future. And here's that same list of easement programs. And what I wanted to show you here is that the 2 that are in the Division of Forestry, Forest Legacy and Forest for the Future, we don't tend to have as many numbers of easements as some of the other programs in DNR, but we have the vast majority of acres that are in easement, are in forestry easements in the DNR. And that really speaks to the type of easements that we tend to have in forestry. Again, our intent is to protect forest land, protect large blocks of forest land from becoming fragmented and parcelized, thereby protecting large areas of habitat as well. And so our easements tend to be fairly large compared to the other easement programs in the DNR. So we have the 2 easement programs, which can be a little confusing. They're both under the Forest Legacy umbrella. However, we have one, Forest for the Future, that is a state program. and that was established by our state legislature in 2008. And then we have the other program, the Forest Legacy Program, which is a federal program created by Congress in 1990 and first used in the state of Minnesota in the year 2000. And so the state partners with the U.S. Forest Service and offers this program within the state. Basically, our conservation approach is to protect forest land, like I've mentioned several times now. And this map shows where the forest land is located in the state. We are protecting the private forest lands for multiple reasons, which I've spoken about already, including timber and jobs, recreation, wildlife, and watershed needs. We operate our state program everywhere in the state. Again, it's to protect forest land, so we are primarily looking at the forested areas of the state. We do have quite a few easements in the southern part of the state. It's just that there's not as much forest land in other areas of the state. And this is a slide about our federal forest legacy program. You'll see in the map there that all of the states participate in this with the Forest Service except for North Dakota. And the brown dots on that map indicate where there are the federal conservation easements, and you can see there are some in the state of Minnesota. Most of them are in the Northeast. That's where the program started. And basically there's about 2.5 million acres of forest land that's protected nationally through this federal program. And the federal program requires the state to identify areas where we will offer the program. So we're not allowed to offer it everywhere in the state like we operate our state program. Instead, we have to identify certain areas where we can offer the federal program. And those are called forest legacy areas, and those are indicated on the map by the heavy outline and the grayed in area. And so if there's a property, a landowner with property interested in an easement that's outside of one of those areas, they automatically would not be eligible for the federal program, but could still be eligible for our state program. Also on the map, you'll see the green dots that are of different sizes. That indicates where we have our federal, currently where we have our federal easements, and the size of the dot indicates the size of the easement. It's hard to see, but we have quite a few small green dots in the southeastern part of the state. That's where we began our programs and had some of our first easements. I'll also show on the map here that there are some dark blue dots called fee acres. So through both of these programs, both the federal and the state, a small part of the program is that we can use our funding to purchase property and fee title and add that property onto our state forest and manage that property along with the state forest. And so I also help to manage some of those projects and coordinate those projects, but that's secondary. We're talking about easements here today. This is the accomplishments that we've had so far in our program, in our easement program. We have to date 53 easements, and over 360,000 acres are protected in easement, and you'll see the dots on the map where they're located. And that appraised value of all of those easement properties are over $88 million in value. And we've also protected approximately 9,000 acres of fee title land. We have parcel sizes that range from fairly small, 20 acres in size, up to 188,000 acres in size. A little background on where our funding comes from. The vast majority of it comes from the state, and then it's pretty evenly split between private funding and federal funding. And then we do have some owners that have chosen to donate some of the value of their easements, and so that's in that owner donation category. I just thought it might be interesting for folks to see where our funding comes from. We couldn't do any of this work that we do without our partners, and we have many partners, funding partners to other types of partners, and the ones that are listed on this slide are not even all of them. And our partners are local government, non-governmental organizations, other divisions in DNR, other state agencies, citizen groups, all kinds of different partners. And it's really great to have such a strong partner base in the state. And of course, we couldn't do any of this work at all without our landowner partners. And so we have landowners that are private family type landowners, and we also have corporate landowners where we've purchased easement on private industrial forest land owned by corporations. And so these are just some pictures of some of the private family landowners that we have easements on their property. And these signs that they're standing by are the signs that are put up when we have federal funding involved and it's a federal project. We require to have some signage up at all of the conservation easement locations, and these just happen to be the federal signs that you can see. They're a little bit bigger and a little prettier than the state signs. Then I was just going to go through some examples of projects that we've had, just to kind of give you a flavor for the different types of conservation easement projects that we currently have. This one is many projects actually. This is a zoomed in map of an area in Rice County. Rice County is just south of the metro area. One of the bigger cities is Faribault. And so this area on the map is just east of Faribault. And we have many easements in Rice County, and on the map you'll see the red areas are the easement properties, not quite all of them in the county, but some of the bigger blocks of them. And there's 18 projects here that where we have purchased conservation easement, working with all private smaller scale landowners, family landowners, and really we try to piece together contiguous or adjacent areas of easement to protect not just the property from an individual landowner, but when you put it all together, it has a bigger impact. It's adjacent protected land that has a much bigger impact environmentally. And so these are some of our oldest easements, and they're great. This is an example of more of an industrial forest landowner and a larger scale easement. This is located in Lake County, and you'll see on the map on the left-hand side that it's a much more scattered ownership than the one I showed previously. The easement properties are in red, and you'll see how they're adjacent to other publicly owned land in the other shades of green. And so it does, in an overall big picture, fit together really nicely to add to the protected areas in Lake County. It was a larger scale project, 3,200 acres, and the primary goal of this project was to protect riparian areas such as shoreline, wild rice lakes, trout streams, and other types of streams. And this particular easement, because it was owned by a private, more of a private industrial ownership, and had been open to the public at some times, we required as an easement term that this remain open to the public for access for hunting and fishing. And I should go back and say that on the previous slide, in fact, I'll just move back. This project down in Rice County with these private family ownership landowners, we did not require public access. And so their property, the easement property, is not open to the public in any way. And again, that is a choice of the landowner. Moving on, this is my last example, a slightly different type of project than the other two examples. This is located in the north central area of the state. And what we were doing here with this project is actually partnering with our DNR fisheries and trying to protect land that had been identified in sub-watersheds surrounding these lakes that tend to be deep, clear, cold lakes that have been identified as important future refuge for certain species as the climate changes. And so the water quality is already very good in these lakes and in these watersheds, and through a process of looking at the watershed, looking at the different land use and land ownerships and the different environmental aspects of the watershed, it was a priority to protect a certain amount of forest land in the watershed because that ultimately protects the quality of the water. And we're still working on these types of projects. We've expanded this into more projects in that area of the state. And so that's all I have for the presentation. Again, please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. You can contact me directly. This is my contact information. It was also provided in the handout. And again, I will be available during the panel session on January 19th for any questions. Thank you so much.